Welcome to our roundtable, Election 2024, How Voters Can Help Prepare California Schools. I'm John Fensterwald, Editor-at-Large at EdSource.
And I'm LaSherica Thornton. I'm the Central Valley based reporter for EdSource.
Exactly 4 weeks from today, California voters will go to the polls where they will consider Proposition 2, a $10 billion state construction bond that will underwrite the costs of TK-12 and community college districts' renovation and modernization. That's a big deal. It's been 8 years since voters approved the state construction bond, but it's dwarfed by the $50 billion worth of construction bonds that 252 school districts and 15 community colleges districts will ask their own voters to pass on November 5th. In the next hour, we'll explore Proposition 2 and how it fits in with school districts' building needs and challenges in an era of aging facilities, climate change, and declining enrollment. We'll look at it through multiple perspectives: of a teacher who saw the impact of a completely renovated school, a parent who has been fighting for facilities justice in far Northern California, two respected superintendents leading their district's bond efforts, and a researcher with the big picture view of what the state has done well and where it has fallen short of providing all students with a healthy and adequate learning environment. Lastly, EdSource would not be able to bring us all together for our monthly roundtables if it weren't for the support of our funders. A big thank you today to the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for making today's roundtable possible. Now for our introductions, and each speaker could just give a little wave. Sarah Noguchi is superintendent of Modesto City Schools, which encompasses two districts, an elementary and middle school district and a high school district. She also leads the California Association of Suburban School Districts. Darrell Camp is superintendent of the San Lorenzo Unified District. It's located in the East Bay, south of Oakland. He is the incoming president of the Association of California School Administrators, or ACSA. Holly Lozano is a literacy coach at Dyer Kelly Elementary and San Juan Unified. Sarah Hinckley is the California Program Manager for the Center for Cities and Schools at UC Berkeley. And Bree Fraley, a Del Norte Unified School District parent, citizen of Tulawadini Nation, and parent leader for True North Organizing Network. So Bree, could you start us off? You live in the most northern county in California, in a temperate rainforest, a land of big trees and, unfortunately, black mold, which is not what you want to see growing on the inside of your school. So tell us about Pine Grove Elementary, what it's like to go to school there. What are the facilities like?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm honored to be here today. My name is Bree Fraley, and I'm a member of the Tulawadini Nation, like John shared with you just moments ago. I'm a lifelong resident of Del Norte, and I like to describe our homelands as temperate. And when we think of Northern California, people often think of Sacramento and the arid temperature and climate. And that's just not the case for us here on the coast in the far north. We have the most rainfall in recorded history in these last few years. And I've met several times with the director of facilities, and his motto is keep the wet out. And we struggle with that here with our 11 schools in Pine Grove in particular. One of the issues that we have is that our school district was formed in 1964. Something drastic happened here in 1964, and that was the tsunami that hit Crescent City, and then the 1964 flood. And so everything was rebuilt very quickly. And for some reason, our schools were built with outdoor settings, so outdoor hallways. And so they're not indoor schools. And so we're dealing with the elements that are beating our schools because they're not enclosed. At Pine Grove, you have open ceilings. You can see the 2x4s. You can see the infrastructure because of leaky roofs. And so that is, a priority to keep the wet out. Real quick, I want to share a story about dilapidated facilities that still haunt my family to this day. So my son, who's now in 8th grade, he was on the last day of school. They did a bike day, and due to disrepair at the school, he had a biking accident, and I had to take him to the ER, and he ended up with stitches. And those costs came on to my family, and actually we got sent to collections because we couldn't afford the cost for the emergency room visit. And just yesterday I had to take him to the doctor behind the hospital. He's in 8th grade. He's 14 now, and he has had a trauma response to the hospital saying, "I'm not going in there. You're not doing this to me." And so he's still impacted years later. He has a trauma response because of the facilities and our inability to upkeep and have nice grounds and safe places. And so really for me, it's about safety and wellness and the well-being of our students up here in Northern California. Thank you for letting me introduce the panel and share a little bit about my experience as being a parent in the most rural county in California.
You mentioned a story about the time you took your kids to a nearby school in Humboldt County and their reaction once they saw a school, which I don't think many of us would see as extraordinary, but what was their reaction?
Yeah, so we went down about an hour and a half south to a school district, a unique school district that's not different in climate from us. And they walk in and to this open expanse of this beautiful field. And again, being able to play outdoors up in Northern California has its challenges due to the weather and rain. But when they walked out onto this campus, they said, "Mom, why can't we go to school here? Can you drive us down here?" And some people do. Some people have elected to take their children out of the Del Mar school district to a more affluent school district where there's more resources available for improved facilities. But that's just something that we can't afford to do.
It's basically a field, right? And you don't have a field at your school, so
Our kids aren't allowed to play in the field because our maintenance and facilities are prioritizing weatherizing, especially the modular buildings.
yeah. So there's a $59 million bond on your ballot next month. You haven't had one for 16 years, I believe. Are you and your neighbors enthusiastic about it? And do you think it might address many of the problems that you see?
When you put it that way, 16 years ago, 2008 doesn't seem like a long time ago. And but I guess it was. And unfortunately, we did a poll, and the majority of the community members here are not in favor of Measure 8 that the school board trustees are putting on the ballot. So I'm really concerned about access to statewide resources if our community isn't supportive of it. And part of the issue is that over 80% of Del Norte County is federal or state lands. We have a very low tax base. We also have Pelican Bay State Prison here that counts for our population that do not pay taxes. And then we just have a majority of our tax-paying citizens do not have school-age children. And so trying to work with the general population to convince them that this is good for all has been a challenge.
So, Sarah Hinckley, where does Del Norte fit into the bigger picture of California school facilities, and how might Prop 2 help this district?
Sure. So I think that story is typical of so many schools and districts around the state. Um, just to step back a little bit, the vast majority of school facility funding in California does come from those local bond measures. So it comes from local taxpayers, and we have a state program the school facility program that we've had since about 1998 that supplements that funding, but it's still a minority of the funding that's available statewide to school districts for facilities. And that school facility program provides matching funds to local districts. So when local districts raise money through bond measures, they can apply for these matching funds. Right now, that matching fund is set to run out of money sometime in early 2025 unless Proposition 2 passes. And if Proposition 2 passes, then the school facility program will be refunded for the first time in 8 years. And those funds will be available to local districts like Del Norte to apply for. Once they've identified projects, then they can apply for funding. It's awarded on a project basis to match or provide a 60% match of the project for what they're applying for. So it is, I know a lot of districts have put measures on the ballot in November in hopes of being able to apply for and secure some of that state funding. And for a lot of districts, that is really the only way they're going to be able to fund some of these projects. I think we'll talk a little bit more later in this panel about the equity concerns, but I know that's what districts like Del Norte are hoping will
Right.
happen if their bonds pass this November.
Yeah, when you look back over 20 years, we do have state bonds, but local districts pay about 80+ % of the cost is falling on local districts. And in the case of Del Norte, it's not a big district, but it's too big to get financial hardship, and it's not a small district. It's not eligible for another benefit, and it's got low property values, which are a lot of districts are in that position, I'm assuming. So, give us a sense again of Prop 2. How will the money be divided, and what's new about Prop 2? The last bond was 2016, Prop 51.
Right. So Prop 2 is $10 billion in total. $8.5 billion of that is designated for K-12 schools. The other $1.5 billion for community colleges. Of that $8.5 billion, it is divided into a little less than half of it. $4 billion is for modernization, which really means retrofitting and rehabilitating school buildings. 3.3 billion is for new construction. So for districts that are experiencing enrollment growth, they can apply for funds to actually build new schools. 600 million is set aside specifically for charter schools and 600 million for career technical education. There are several new things about it. I guess I'll mention a few. One is that now districts can use this funding for transitional kindergarten and state-funded preschool programs. That used to have its own funding source that ran out, but now it will be an eligible expense for these programs. It does also specify that up to 10% of both the modernization and new construction funding will be essentially set aside for what are called small school districts. And in the law, those are defined as those having 2,500 students or fewer. There's also a slight change to the way that districts are required to contribute to the project cost. So it used to be that for all modernization projects, districts contributed 40%. For new construction projects, they contributed 50%. They made a very slight modification so that districts with some measures of hardship can get now up to 65% of the project modernization projects and up to 55% of new construction projects. There are a few other changes about what the money can be used for, but those are the main ones.
Thank you. Maybe we'll get back and to look at that formula a little later to see whether that's an equitable way of looking at it or not. I know you have thoughts about that. But one thing that folks may not recognize, a lot of people, is that $4 billion of that 8.5 billion for K-12 will go to first in line for unfunded projects from the last bond, Prop 51 in 2016. And that's the way the system's always worked. If you if you applied legitimately, you're in line if they ran out of money. So this is a new bond. The first $4 billion will go to that. So, I mean, what does that say about the state's commitment to fund schools if we're sort of in a perpetual cycle of funding the last bond with this new money?
Well, it says there's just incredible need and demand that's not being met. So yes, at least 3.9 billion, close to 4 billion of projects have already been approved by the state allocation board, but we don't have funds for that. There have been efforts to estimate the need that's out there. The state auditor estimated, $1 to $2 billion a year just in applications that districts would bring forward. And that, I think, doesn't really reflect the actual need because many districts, as Bree was saying earlier, simply don't have the property values or capacity to put bonds on the ballot on a regular basis. So we really have incredible need. We have almost $40 billion in K-12 local bonds on the ballot. And there's going to be only about $4 billion of matching funds. So that all of that funding
Right.
is essentially accounted for already. And we really don't have a mechanism for estimating how far behind we are, but it's clear that we need something like that so that when we set bond measures, we have a good estimate for how much we need to be raising in order to make
Yeah.
facilities equitable and decent for all of our students.
So it's not to say that, some of the districts that will likely apply for this bond may be getting money from the previous bond too, which will go towards defraying their costs. So it's not I mean, we are the same districts in many ways, but it's for past projects. So if you're applying for new projects, there may be a chance that you're going to be on the next unfunded list, I'm assuming. Um, so let's turn to Holly Lozano. You're a veteran literacy coach of a before and after renovation.
Yes, I am.
So you've got a good vantage point to tell us. What was it like before, and what difference has it made now?
Well, first, thank you for having me today. Before, this is my 10th year at this school, and so when I first came here, it was pretty much describing what people have already said here. It was ceilings had leaks, and there was kind of crumbling buildings, and the AC didn't work, and the furniture was outdated and broken, and there was no storage. I think the biggest issue we had was with safety. Um, uh, the neighborhood doesn't always have the safest environment, and so there was a lot of concern around how the safety, and we often had our school broken into, and things were stolen, and it was just kind of a constant problem. We had people would sleep inside the school grounds. People would just hang out in the school grounds. There would be different paraphernalia left over from the night before if there was, somebody was here with alcohol or anything like that. And so there was a lot happening, and it just didn't make the community or the staff, I think, feel safe.
So has it become a community center? Has it made a difference to the
Yeah,
neighborhood?
yeah, since one of the things that we did when we were building the new school, because we didn't just remodel, we actually completely tore down our old school and built the new school, is we really reached out to the students and their families, and the builders reached out to the teachers, and we were able to give some input on what we thought would be helpful, what we thought would matter, and they did the same thing, the students and their families. And I think with that all those voices in the conversation, it really made everybody sort of buy into the project. And I think with that, it made everybody sort of protect the project. And so within our community now, this is the place to be. People want to come to this school. They want to be a part of our community. They want to come to the playground, even if it's closed. They want to enjoy all that we have to offer, because there's so much here that it's better than a park. We just have so much, and it's safer. There's gates. It just feels safer. And I think that being
Mhm.
on the school grounds, that just alone makes them feel safer. And within, because the school was completely built, the model was changed from an outdoor school, as we already heard about. This is a completely indoor school, and so you basically go in through the front doors, and that's as far as you can go as a parent or as a visitor without checking in through the office. And so, with that, it just makes everyone feel more secure within the building. So if anything is happening out in the community that maybe is unsafe, we feel perfectly safe here, and I think that that's very reassuring to families and to the staff.
And just one more follow-up question. How has the facility really just improved even student learning?
Well, because we when we were building the new school, we really took into account all the kids that would be coming, because we did, just as a side, when we left in the end of June 2019 and we came back in August of 2019 for the summer break, we also got about 200 more students. And so the school was built with the future in mind, and it was built with our needs in mind. So it was built with the consideration of having a speech room. It was built with the consideration of having a room for counselors. It was built with the consideration of having an intervention room for interventionists to work with small groups. It just was really well thought out, and I think that it just having everybody having a place is just really important. Everybody feels, I think it makes you feel more valued as a professional. I think it makes students feel more valued as students, and the families are recognized that we're really giving everything we can to our students and the community. So having those spaces designated and really thought through was really impactful.
Do you mind just giving us one example of, you mentioned everybody loving to have their own space, our kids want to stay, just give us an example.
Okay, well, initially we would have people teaching in the hallway because we didn't have space, or in the hallways. And so now there's a space that's designated so that the teachers, intervention teachers, can pull kids into the classroom. We've had speech teachers have to teach in closets. They literally, a renovated closet was sort of where they had to go to do speech therapy. We had resource teachers, wherever they could find kind of a nook or cranny in a school was where they had to be. And now there's a space. There's a space for them to do their hard work. And I think that's been really beneficial.
So,
Some of
do you
the
know,
modifications, I wanted to also talk to some of the things that have changed in the new building. So besides the space, we also have more storage in the classrooms. That was something we didn't have. Teachers are having to buy their own storage. And now we have storage that's provided. It's a big wall sliding doors with whiteboards all around the classroom, and makes a huge difference in just keeping things put away. Just a huge is organizing. Um, we have bathrooms, more bathrooms than you could ever want. That seems like a small thing, but when you had about 2 bathrooms in the other building, and now you have like about 6 bathrooms, it makes a really big difference. People just can. We have a large school, large campus. We have nearly 800 kids, so that's a lot of teachers. We have to be able to get to the bathrooms during our breaks, get back to class, and that was a big
yeah,
beneficial thing.
I'm assuming that it may help retain teachers to your school, but tell me
It
if it,
has. It
yeah,
completely has. We have teachers that are new to our site well, we have one in particular that's new this year, and she was planning to retire after this year. And now she's saying, oh, I'm going to at least be here 5 years because I love this school. I just love being here. I love the environment. And we have plenty of challenges here, but the environment just makes it manageable. You just feel like you can do it. And so that's an example. But honestly, at the old school, we had a high turnover of teachers. Every year somebody was leaving, or more than a few people were leaving. And now we rarely have people leave unless there's a promotion, or somebody's
yeah,
moving out of the area. But it's not
okay,
something that happens like it did.
thank you. I'm assuming superintendents like to hear that. Let's turn to our superintendents. Superintendent Noguchi, what are your district's priorities for Measure X is yours, $85 million bond? How did you choose those priorities and strike a balance between your pressing needs and less immediate but essential for changes moving down the line?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. You know, it's like what's been said as far as the need for Modesto City Schools. There is two school districts, like you'd said. So I'm going to speak primarily just around the elementary school district. The elementary school district, when I got here in 2018, with the leadership and the staff prior to me getting here, successfully passed a bond my first year, or two bonds, when I first got here as superintendent 7 years ago. But the bond that was passed prior to that was in 1987. So you can figure it's many, many years with many needs, and looking at how best to prioritize. So we went out to, for this particular bond, which is bond measure X, we did a survey in December, went out to our elementary parents and community and asked what they were looking for, what are their interests. And then we wrote the bond around that, because obviously we want to pass the bond, and therefore we're aligning it to what they see the needs are. And so our bond language is really upfront. It's cafeterias and multipurpose rooms, just like Haley spoke about, is just really bringing in, having a space for everyone to come together, build a culture, not only for the school itself, but also for the community, and acting as community centers for the community. In addition to leaky roofs and plumbing and restrooms, however, we do have a deferred maintenance program that we do put quite a bit of investment in there, because we really want to be able to use our bonds for new facilities. However, that's still a safeguard should we need that. Emergency alarm systems, parents are very much concerned around safety measures, not only single points of entry, but also how students are being dropped off to school and picked up, along with alarm systems. And then, of course, our classroom environments, very much trying to work on the facilities. We have schools that are 50 to 90 years old. So really looking at what sort of facilities can we build to ensure students have access to 21st century skills, which is really the science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. So that's what we're looking for in Measure X, which is for 85 million.
So did you propose Measure X with state matching money in mind, and have you had been able to secure state matching money in the past?
What I can say is for Measures D and E, which the voters, thanking the voters always for passing Measures D and E in 2018, we do have projects on that list, which is part of much of what I just outlined here: cafeterias, entrance, single points of entry, and such. We do have that on the list that you spoke about earlier, so we hopefully are in the queue for those dollars. Really, our desire would be to not think of it as a bond, a single bond. It's over and done. It's a bond program. So if we can get some matching funds or partial funds for what's on the list, we can then extend out Measures D and E, with the hopes that Measure X also will be added to that list as we move forward for the future.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you did meet with, I mean, you had community meetings to establish these priorities, so that I know often the language of bonds is vague, general, but do you think the community will see that these are their needs, including safety, I imagine, right?
Yes. So in the past, we had a bond measure in 2001 that went to two brand new schools. Literally, this was for the high school district, but went to just two schools. This last set of bonds, D&E, you can see across the district, facilities that the community are seeing being built. So they see that the promise that we made with D&E is in fact coming to fruition with our new multipurpose rooms and cafeterias, in addition to all the solar that we've been able to put up. Now, some of those were bond funded at the high school district, but frankly, COVID was very helpful in that regards with HVAC and solar. And so the community itself is seeing a lot of building. And so I think that is helping the enthusiasm for yet another bond, because this will be for our district, because again, elementary and high school, this will be our fourth in 7 years. So that's quite a bit when you consider it's been 40 years since the elementary did the bond many, many years ago. So
yeah. One last question: is that by stretching them out, fourth bond in X number of years, is that one way of stabilizing the tax increase without, sort of going for a lot more money, fewer times? Or is this one way that have stability and the community knows what to expect sort of from that?
Because we're two school districts, our funding for bonds, the capacity we can go out for is considerably less. If we were a unified school district, we could go out $60 per 100,000. We can only do 30 per 100,000. And so that's why there's smaller bonds over the course of time. Hopefully that answered your question.
It did.
Okay.
And then obviously in the Central Valley, there are, well, the Central Valley is known for dangerously high temperatures anyway. So the districts here, they've had to prioritize projects based on that. So I want to go to you, Superintendent Camp. Even in the Bay Area, there seems to now be a need to address hotter weather there as well. Can you kind of tell us about the priorities that you have for Measure Q, or about the need for air conditioning in your district?
Absolutely. And I had the distinct honor also of serving in the Central Valley. I was right next to Dr. Noguchi a few years ago. So I made the move to the Bay Area in 2019. And even though I made the move to the Bay Area as superintendent, I grew up in the Bay Area. And the Bay Area now is a different place than when I was growing up a few years ago. When I went to school, yeah, we didn't have air conditioning at the school system where I was. That wasn't the norm in our classrooms. And I can say, now serving as a superintendent in San Lorenzo, which is right next to where I grew up, it's grown to I would say an urgent need right now. It significantly changes the climate situation. It significantly changes the learning environment for our students. And when I was superintendent in the Central Valley, all of our buildings had air. That was the norm. That's not the norm in many of our Bay Area school districts. And it impacts learning. I just was at a town hall meeting, I think it was just last night or last week. And one of the teachers was saying that some of their students they're trying to make a decision of whether or not to come to school. We just had a pretty decent heat wave in the Bay Area that's ending today or yesterday. And that was the choice that students are trying to make. Should I stay at home? And once again, those are for students that have home and are fortunate enough to have air in the home. Many of the Bay Area homes don't either. So there's no way out if you don't have it at home and you don't have it at school. You're kind of stuck. But for a student to have to make that choice, and families have to make the choice of go to an uncomfortable learning condition in our schools, or go stay at home in air, is a choice that students should not have to make. Uh, Students should be able to learn in an environment that's comfortable for learning. And once again, I was sort of in that pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, suck it up. But I can say, if I'm not willing to sit in that classroom for even 15 minutes to 30 minutes, because I go around and visit classrooms, then students shouldn't have to be in there for the whole day. And just one more note why it's so urgent. Just last week, I went to a volleyball game. And once again, we know that it's good for students to participate in extracurricular activities. We know it. But as I approached the gym, I noticed that our campus security officers were sitting outside of the gym. It was obvious why. You go inside the gym, and it was about a 20-degree difference between inside and outside. Inside, outside. The volleyball players were still playing. The referee had to make a decision prior to starting the game whether or not we're going to be able to have that game. So in San Lorenzo schools, we were able to leverage some of the federal fundings due to COVID in order to increase our air conditioning in 4 of our 16 schools. Those projects should be complete in probably the next 6 to 8 months. And we want to accelerate that. I just truly believe that every student should be able to go to school and have a nice, comfortable environment for learning. I would say also the point that I think it was Haley you made too about the expectations for schools have changed. Many of our schools in San Lorenzo were built in the you're talking 1950, 1960 category. So they're 60, 75 years old. And when schools were built then, it was the expectation that schools were going to be these open environments for community use, and open was kind of the philosophy. That's changed now. That's clearly changed, where parents and families and students, everybody's expecting schools to be I won't say fortresses, but the security radar has definitely increased with our, our United States conditions and that we have. So yeah, we're putting up fences, security cameras, single points of entry. Those are all different, a different mindset of when the mindset that we had when schools were built. And that's the community expectations right now. The only other part I want to mention is related to technology. Due to COVID, many of our school systems brought in a whole lot of new technology for our students. Well, it's one thing to buy the device, and we were fortunate enough to have the money to buy the device, but of course, there's going to be a need to replenish the devices. But just as important, if you have a device, but you don't have the infrastructure or the information highway that's wide enough to support the device, then you're going to be frustrated with the device because the speed won't be conducive to learning as well. So those are just some of the challenges, but the climate situation is real. It's apparent. I feel it every day I visit classes, especially on the heat wave. And it's not every day, but the days that it's hot, I have to say, yeah, it's a challenge getting students to be there
Yeah,
and to stay there.
thank you.
Mhm.
We received a lot of great questions from viewers actually when they signed up, and we won't be able to get to all of them, but let's go through some of them now. And one is how is declining enrollment and the possibility of future school closures factoring into current investment in facilities? So particularly superintendents, did you plan? How do you factor in a declining enrollment that you project? Particularly, I guess, San Lorenzo in the Bay Area. I'm sure it's hard to go to parents and say, well, we can't fix your school because in 5 years from now we may close it. That wouldn't be particularly well received. How do you then plan for declining enrollment?
Yeah, that's one of my most difficult considerations to recognize that we in the Bay Area, many of us are experiencing pretty severe declining enrollment. We're talking the last 10 years at 2 to 3% a year in some of our districts. So it's significant. So it is a balancing act, but just because we have declining enrollment, there's not an automatic correlation to a decrease in schools. We still have fewer students that are attending the same number of schools. And when we have declining enrollment, oftentimes those classrooms get repurposed. One example is there's a growing expectation to attend to the social emotional needs of students. And some of our school sites have established wellness rooms. And with that, and in San Lorenzo wellness rooms, we have social workers on campus now. They need a spot. We have counselors at our elementary schools. They need a spot. So the space is being repurposed in order to provide a greater level of services and programs for students. Right along with that is sort of I would say the California investment in TK, essentially adding another grade level means something for us. We were one of those fortunate districts that won a grant to expand our early education offerings in terms of facilities. So we're expanding our preschool offerings and our TK offerings also. But those have facility needs that go along with that. And then another avenue that many people don't consider or talk about is expanded learning. Remember, the California has invested in expanded learning also. Well, yes, there is a possibility that that same classroom space can be utilized beyond the school day. We call it out of school time learning. However, you can imagine sometimes it's sort of disruptive for a teacher to say, hey, you got to vacate your classroom at a certain time because we have students that would be here beyond the school day. Just think if a teacher wants to provide their own tutoring services for students, but now they're being displaced by a out of school time learning program or expanded learning program, that's pretty disruptive there. So those are some of the examples of how the classes, even there's not a direct correlation of a declining enrollment and closing of schools.
I would add to what Dr. Kemp said, and that is the voters that approved Prop 28, so the arts, music, the VAPA proposition that was voted on, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, that in itself has also encroached on space. So if you're not going to have a music program or arts docents coming in, or depending on how the plans are with that, that's taking space as well. There's only so many people, so many kids, programs can use the cafeteria midway through the day. There is space that's needed. One, I think the big one is TK, expanded learning, and Proposition 28.
So I have a question. How are needs of the schools being determined? Well, we've talked about it on a local level, but Sarah, how does the state determine, if it does, state needs that a certain amount of money or priorities should be made? Does Prop 2 reflect this at all, or is it all local control?
Yeah, I guess the short answer is the state doesn't do much in terms of determining priorities or setting priorities, aside from the few set asides that are built into Prop 2. So there is money specified for charter schools, for career technical education, which is a priority. But really, it's, there are two parts to this answer. One is that it's really up to local districts to determine what their local priorities are. So that might be an arts facility, that might be HVAC upgrades. And I think that's important for local districts to maintain control over. The challenge is that, as we talked about earlier, there's only limited funding, and the state funding is only going to go so far. And so I think there is a real need for the state to decide, are there priorities we want to direct that funding for? So we've talked a lot about extreme heat. There was a bill passed by the legislature that the governor vetoed, that would have had the state create a green facilities master plan that would essentially have gone out to a sample of districts and tried to ascertain how many students are learning in classrooms that are 90, 95 degrees during these extreme heats. That's an example of how the state could gather data and then set some priorities, that wouldn't be overriding local control, but would just be shaping some of the ways that we send state funding to achieve some specific goals, or to really make sure that all students are at a certain base level of funding. But right now, there's not a mechanism by which that's happening.
And just to add to being my role with the Association of California School Administrators, get to hear from a lot of administrators, and California is it's just so diverse in terms of our needs. It's really hard to set a statewide priority, because invariably you end up running into situations where some districts are going to feel a lot more advantaged than others. For example, if the state decided to spend or prioritize HVAC projects, then my colleagues, I'm sure in the Central Valley, would say, "Wait a minute, we already have HVAC in our schools, and why are all the dollars going toward the districts on the coast?" And you can imagine the way that conversation could play out. That's just one example of why I think it's better to let the local school districts determine what the greatest needs are. I was hearing from a colleague up in, probably close to Del Norte, and the superintendent up there was saying that they really need a gym. It's a community facility, and the community doesn't have a gym. So not only do students have to experience PE outdoors or in other spaces, but they could have a PE in the gym, and the facility can be used for more civic engagement throughout the school year. Just one example.
LaSherica, oh, go ahead, Holly.
So you mentioned the input. And so one of the ways that we gathered input for our new build was, like I mentioned, was the students and the families and the teachers. But one of the probably the biggest things that the teachers asked for was for the school to represent the diversity, our diverse population. And so what we asked to have happen is we based on the amount of hallways we had, we kind of figured out that there was enough hallways to have a continent be basically in each hallway. And so to reflect our diverse community, each hallway is a continent. So we have Asia, we have Antarctica, we have Australia, all the different continents. So it just really, right from the very beginning, the moment you walk in our building, you also see greetings in all different languages. So I think with having the voice of the families is just so important to to getting everybody involved and feeling valued, having their voice be valued. But in terms of what priorities beyond the student voice, I think it's a real challenge to, you're looking at the potential enrollment, but it's hard. I'm assuming, and based on what we're going through, it's, even though we have a new school, although those Prop 28 came after the new school, you know, the TK, the new, having a TK in every school came after our new build. And so we're already going, oh, well, so how's that going to work here? And so it's such a challenge to look at to prioritize what you need when you don't even know what's ahead. And so we prioritized everything we knew with what we knew at the time. But now we have different priorities that are coming through, like you mentioned. And so that's been a real challenge for us here.
So, Sharika, you've been looking into the issue of TK facilities and speaking with some of the advocates in districts, and sort of the opposite of the local, other side of local control is that the state says you should have TK and open it up in 3 years, and you're looking around and there may not be money for facilities and there's nothing allocated. The Prop 2 says, yes, you can ask for supplemental money, but many districts will not be able to get who knows how much money in matching. So, Sharika, what are you hearing from the TK folks? Are they frustrated about that?
I mean, the simple answer would be yes. And so, you know, Superintendent Camp, you mentioned the grant funding that you guys have gotten. There's been some funding specifically for TK facilities. However, promised funding of like 550 million for TK facilities is cut. And so that of course is going to put districts in the place of, you know, this funding may be coming, but all of these other needs need to be addressed. So I think I kind of have a question for, and any other panelists can tackle this, would be considering how this funding is supposed to be to address all of these needs, but TK is expanding, and we're gonna have to either renovate or construct new spaces or move people, which is things that I'm hearing from different districts. How do you guys view the balance between setting those local priorities and also having to meet needs that for something like TK expansion that's required?
Do you want to take this one, Dr. Noguchi? Yeah.
I can, you know, I can certainly try. I think when TK rolled out, I believe it was 3 years ago. It could be 4 years. It was like a slow rollout. We did our best to be able to identify space for TK for a couple reasons. One, it's good for students to be able to get in a high quality instructional program, social emotional, coming out of COVID. It was the right thing to do for the population. That's one. Additionally, that's also increasing your enrollment. If you're a declining enrollment, you're bringing in another grade, that can kind of counterbalance it. Here in the Central Valley, we're getting some of Dr. Kemp's families coming over to Central Valley because it's a little cheaper. So we are growing in enrollment, only by a little, but enough to say that we are slightly growing. But we did prioritize it. We did identify the number of students. We also took a look at our preschool classrooms and areas within preschool, because we know preschool kids that were once in preschool are now going to be in TK. So we tried to capitalize in that work. But we did take it as a priority because we believed it was the right thing to do for students and families. Dr. Kemp?
Yeah, I think we're still in somewhat of an experimentation phase because, like Dr. Noguchi mentioned, the expansion of TK is relatively new, and we've been adding a month every year to the students eligible. But when TK started, I don't know, might have been 10 years ago now, we had a better idea of what the numbers would look like. But with the expanded birthdays in terms of kids being eligible, we're getting more TK kids than what we had, 8-9 years ago. And I'm going to say this: we might be just the tip of the iceberg. If you look at most districts, if you look at your kindergarten enrollment and you compare that to TK, there's a gap. And if all the kids that were eligible for TK actually access TK, I think more and more school districts would have an issue. And you know, once again, I give credit to the school districts. We're problem solvers, so we'll figure it out. But it won't be the best opportunity or the best learning environment for kids. And I think somebody mentioned something about bathrooms earlier and stuff you take for granted. But if anybody ever looks in a kindergarten classroom, or the bathrooms are small. They really are. So it's not like you can just automatically take your declining enrollment kids in elementary and now put the TK kids in that classroom. It doesn't work. The fit is not there. So it's just something that I think the state, to the state's credit, we expanded the grade level, uh, but there is some question about the adequacy of funding in order to, fully support that investment in an extra grade level.
The system works by first come, first served. It's a way that has been for several bonds. And as superintendents and Sarah Hinckley, I'd like to your thoughts about whether that's a good way of doing it, and whether or not medium and small districts feel that it's harder for them to get access to it. And what are your thoughts?
Well, the first come, first serve, I guess there are a couple of reasons why it might be of concern. One is that it is literally, somebody asked in the Q&A, is it really, your application gets dated and then gets in line? It does really work like that. And that does advantage districts that have more resources, larger districts with larger facilities departments that can move projects through more quickly. That's a concern. It also means that districts have to wait a long time to find out if they're going to get those matching funds. And if you're a district that can afford to pay for that project by yourself and the state matching funds are going to sort of backfill, then waiting isn't as bad as if you're a district that's really depending on those matching funds to be able to get that project completed. So it is perceived as adding to the inequities in the program, that it sort of replicates the unequal resources that local districts have already. So that's one downside to operating it in that way.
Although, Sarah,
Yeah.
I just want to say some of our smaller school districts and some in the rural parts of the state, even though Prop 2 doesn't fix all of the funding inequities, such as the first come, first serve, there is at least is an acknowledgement of having more school districts qualify for the hardship dollars, and then our small districts with having a set aside for the smallest districts won't have the infrastructure in order to pursue the dollars like some of the bigger school districts. So there was some acknowledgement of that in Prop 2.
Yes. And neither of your districts will qualify for the small districts or hardship, but Sarah Hinckley, what does that 10% set aside mean? Does it mean that smaller districts are guaranteed to get in line and get some of that money, or what does it mean how would the 10% set aside work?
Yeah, so the bill says that 10% of the up to 10% of the funds can go to districts with 2,500 students or fewer. And it also specifies that those districts can qualify for what's called preliminary apportionment, which is a system that's available to charter schools currently, where once the application is submitted and initially approved, the funding will be reserved for them before the whole process is completed. So keep in mind that more than half of California districts meet that criteria of 2,500 students or fewer. And we know that so that's if they qualify for 10% of the overall bond, well, they already have almost 10% of students. So it's not as if they're getting a huge set aside out of the bill. And we also know that the whole program is going to be so oversubscribed that there's still going to be districts that don't meet this. Now, I will say, we need more money in the system, right? Not less. So clearly, we want to meet this demand now, but we need to really acknowledge that districts, we need more funding to be getting into the system, and we need ways for districts with lower levels of resources to be able to access those funds.
And then John, just real quick, we did have quite a few reader questions about, how charter schools fit into this. And so one of those is how charters even get the money if they can't place bonds on the ballot. So how they get that money, how do they get money for matching funds?
Sarah, do you know that answer?
Yeah, so charter schools cannot issue bonds, but they can borrow money as independent entities. So the program does work differently for charter schools. That's partly why they get that separate preliminary apportionment. But they do have to come up with 50%. They have funding that's available for new construction. So they do have to come up with that 50% matching funds, typically by leasing or having some other form of income.
Yeah, or it might come from their ADA, the money they get from the state as well.
Right.
Yeah. The last question, I'm gonna let you start off, and this is probably the toughest one. Says there's not going to be enough money in the bond for all schools, which we know, we've talked about that. So how do we ensure that it is equitable? And I guess that's a difficult question because the language has been written, but how from here moving ahead to creating a system that is equitable, what would you like to see in it? And open, Sarah Hinckley, you can start, and then if others have some thoughts about a way to make the system more equitable than it is now.
Sure. So I do think equity, can mean different things. So people might come at it from different perspectives. To me, I think often of how we fund general education, which is that we have a system in California where every district gets a certain amount per student to ensure that we have a base level of education funding for every student. I think my definition of an equitable state program would be that we compensate for the differences in local wealth that exists between districts. And the legislation does take a tiny step toward setting a sliding scale for matching local funding so that districts that meet certain criteria contribute a slightly lower amount of the project cost. But our research has shown that the discrepancies between districts in terms of wealth are really vast. So the bonding capacity of the wealthiest 20% of districts is about 8 to 10 times per student of the lowest 20% of districts. So we're really talking about orders of magnitude of ability to raise funds. And the bill has a sliding scale of just those districts get essentially an additional 5% of matching funds. So really the scale of disparity isn't being addressed by the state program. I think to move toward a more equitable program, we would need to see a much greater recognition of the different capacities that districts have. You all had a great article today about districts that have to go one project at a time to their voters because they simply don't have the property wealth to be able to access that. And it's much more expensive for their taxpayers to pay for a renovated high school. So that would be my response.
Anyone else? Bree, does that work for you and Del Norte? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that would be great. I think I heard something around some statistics to make that more clear about, for example, wealth districts would get per capita per student in this bonding capacity around 16,000 per student, whereas my student up in the far north in an impoverished community would get around 5,000. And for me, it's about fairness. And so when I think about equity, I think about what is fair. And then, if California wants to be the best in our academics, we need to be fair to all students so that we all have a fair chance at meeting our academic goals.
Holly, you were shaking your head too.
I have a mixed feeling about it because I feel like it has to be based on the need. And I agree with everybody that they're saying that the wealthier communities they have more opportunity than some of the more impoverished communities. And so in terms of raising money and just property wealth, and so but I know it's not quite that simple. In the district where I am, the schools and the lower income neighborhoods started out getting the renovations done, it appeared to be done first. And I know there was some pushback from the other parts of the district, saying like, why them, not us? And I think that's just a natural feeling, why them, not us. We have to look at the whole picture, the whole entity. Who are we serving? What are the needs? And what can each community bring? And that just has, to me, that's where the equity has to be.
Superintendent's final word.
I don't have an answer. My final word is I know there are a lot of smart people, and I think we're asking the right question. And I would just encourage all the organizations to keep in conversation, even defining equity. We brought on through Governor Brown's leadership the local control funding formula was an acknowledgement that there are different situations across the state, and I just think we need to stay in communication and dialogue and discussion, trying to come up with a formula that makes sense for California. But all those organizations, CASH, GASPO, AXA, should be at the table to have those conversations.
Finally, Superintendent Noguchi, any
I
final?
100% agree with Dr. Kemp. When you first asked the question, my first thought was bring a lot of smart people together and look to see how we solve the riddle. Because I agree with Haley. I work in a district where there's high poverty, and then there's the other side of the tracks, there isn't high poverty, and everyone has opinions around that. And so it is a riddle to be solved, because there's great need, and I think we've heard that across this whole hour, and what we need to do. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's a riddle to be solved in the future, but the immediate thing before us is a $10 billion bond that folks will vote on in a month. So I want to thank all of our panelists, including those who are working behind the scenes answering questions. Thank you again to the William and Flora Hewitt Foundation for their support. So again, it's been a great discussion. I thank my colleague, LaSherica Thornton, and I thank all of you for a really insightful hour.